Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. I have my coffee here, so I hope you don't mind if I'm sipping on that as I share with you a message that I think is important for us today, because as I've been thinking about this whole situation that we're going through, a lot of things have been going through my mind about what is God telling us through this? Is there a message we should be hearing from the Lord through this? How could the coronavirus disaster, is there any way that it could actually be a blessing for the church? And I think that it could, and I want to talk about that right now. To some extent, I'm relating this to an experience that I had back in 1974 with the tornado that hit Xenia, Ohio. And I know that First Church of Christ on Ledbetter Road in Xenia, for them, the tornado made a huge impact on the future of that church. How they responded to that crisis was tremendous. They opened the doors to the church, if I recall, to the community. I don't remember, I wasn't involved that much at that time. I was just getting started in my Christian walk. But I know that the tornado proved to be a catalyst for tremendous growth and spiritual revival for the next decade of that church's life. Many people were baptized. Tons of new preachers and missionaries came out of the church following that period and went into the harvest field for Jesus. The point is that that crisis, which was the tornado that literally wiped out the town of Xenia, Ohio, that crisis was a catalyst for growth for them, and it could be for us as well, this current crisis. But it all depends on how we respond. And the response that will not produce that kind of change is the response that fixates on the getting back to exactly the way we were before. First of all, that kind of mindset is unrealistic. There's no way that we're going to be able to go back to the way we were before. This event has changed us. It has changed our nation. It has changed our interactions with one another. It has changed us deeply, I think, and permanently. We will never be the same. And these changes are automatic and unavoidable. However, there are some changes that depend on us. Some changes that we need to decide how we're going to respond. I am convinced that this event could be the push that the church needs to make some much needed changes. But before I can get into that, we need to do some work. We need to review some history. We need to go back to our roots. We need to take a fresh look at how the New Testament church, the primitive church, did things. And yes, we need to revive that word that we once used a lot and refresh that word, and I'm talking about the word restoration. To find those roots, God has provided for us a history of the first years of the primitive church. I'm talking about the book of Acts. And this amazing second volume of Dr. Luke's 2-volume series, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, narrates the history of that newly formed movement of believers in the Messiah Jesus. It helps to understand a little bit about this background, about the background of the book. It was addressed to a man named Theophilus, and that name literally means friend of God. Some scholars think it wasn't really a real person, but it was Luke's way of saying this goes out to anyone who is or wants to be a friend of God. Now, I think he was a real person. I think he was some kind of Roman authority who was not yet a believer, but who was interested. And he wanted to know what the church was and what is this new movement. He was probably what we might call a seeker. Someone who is open to listening about Christianity. He may have been someone who had a role in the Apostle Paul's trial in Rome as well. So the book of Acts may have been a kind of document presented in defense of the Apostle Paul. If you recall, Paul was ended up in a Roman jail, chained to a soldier, actually a Roman soldier, and the book ends with him still there. So it could have been a book that was presented in his defense. Luke was showing his readers, both the original readers and future readers, how the early church lived out their mission. For the early church believers, Christianity was not just a belief system. It was not just a religion in the sense of a set of beliefs to affirm together with a group. along with a set of behaviors or religious rites one is expected to perform if we are to be a member of that group. That's how most people define religion. No, these people saw themselves as a people in the grip of a mission that had to be fulfilled. And the evidence for this is just abundant. Remember, on the account of the ascension, they were all looking up into the sky after Jesus had ascended, and the angel came to them and said, "Why are you looking up in the sky? You need to get to work." So they turned their attention away from gazing into the sky and onto their role as witnesses. We see it in how all the believers went about preaching the gospel in the book of Acts. We see how ordinary members of the church, deacons, servants, could, in the very next chapter, become powerful evangelists. We see how the entire book is dedicated to telling a story, the story of the continuous spread of the faith throughout the pagan world. And we see how certain stories are framed in such a way as to depict the way people came to know Jesus. And there are numerous accounts of individuals and groups coming to the faith. In other words, the entire book is about the mission of being witnesses for Jesus. And it's sad how many studies of this book completely miss this point. Oftentimes people approach the book of Acts with a desire to know how to do church. And these are not the same thing. One thing is this movement that was a mission. Like I said, the people were in the grip of a mission. It's not about really how to do church. It's not about how to organize our church or how to the correct liturgy for the church, or the correct government for the church, what ceremonies a church should perform. That, yes, there are indications of that in the book of Acts, but that's not the purpose. That's not the reason Luke wrote it. When we use the book for that purpose, we're not using it as Luke intended it to be used. But you might ask, they did do church, right? Yes, they did do church, but that was kind of the result of the mission that they were doing. The mission was the key factor, and the way they went about that, the specific details of that, are really a side issue. The main point was the mission. And the real question then is, how did they do mission? Luke does show us how they did mission, and the pattern is repeated, the pattern is clear, the pattern is startlingly simple, and at the same time powerful. And here's what they did. The Christians would go out and talk to people about Jesus, often to single individuals, sometimes in homes, occasionally in larger venues like the Areopagus in Athens when Paul went to Athens. And once they found a host that was receptive, it's really interesting. It's kind of almost like the coronavirus. The virus is out looking for hosts where it will be receptive. In the same way, the Christians were going out with the gospel message, looking for hosts that would be receptive. And once they found that, they went to their homes and started teaching the way of the Lord. And this pattern was so frequent that people started calling them the people of the way. And you see that title given to the Christians several times throughout the book of Acts. And what was this way? Where did it come from? Where did they get this? How did they learn this technique, if we can call it that? Well, it's right there in front of our eyes, and yet so often we have not seen it. It's so clear, you won't believe how clear it is. You will think, how did I ever miss this? This way was taught to them by Jesus himself. We can see it throughout the Gospels, but perhaps we see it most clearly in the account of Jesus' encounter with the men who were walking on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. The story starts out with Jesus seeing two men talking amongst themselves. And Luke tells us that Jesus drew near to them and went with them. Notice, he drew near to them and went with them. In other words, he went with them in the way. So simple, so powerful. Jesus sees some men talking about him, draws near to them, and walks with them. He did not wait for them to come to Sunday school or to Sunday morning worship service. He saw them on the road, drew near to them, went to them, walked with them in the way. And notice how Luke, in his telling of the story, deliberately uses certain language. He doesn't just say, "What are you talking about?" He says, "What are you talking about as you walk?" As you walk. What are you talking about as you go about in the way? And after listening for some time, we don't know how long, a moment comes and a kind of opening in the conversation, a door of opportunity, and Jesus enters that door. And Luke tells us, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Luke 24, verse 27. And then Luke gives us the key to the early church's growth. He reveals the pattern that we will see continuously throughout his second volume, the Acts of the Apostles. The men said to Jesus, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them, Luke 24:29. And in their own home, Jesus continued what he had begun on the road, expounding the scriptures to them, and Luke tells us their eyes were open and they recognized Jesus. And Luke sums up what Jesus did with the words, "Coming out of the mouth of these men, the men of Emmaus, he opened to us the scriptures," verse 32. What is astounding about this account is that it perfectly describes the method the church used throughout the book of Acts. Luke opens the Acts narrative with the first believers meeting in someone's home to worship, pray, and seek the guidance of the Lord. In Acts chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Later on, God speaks to Peter in a dream and commands him to go to the house of the Gentile military commander named Cornelius. Peter obeys. He goes to the house and tells them all about Jesus and that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Acts chapter 10, verse 43. So Cornelius and his entire household believe and are baptized into Jesus. In the account of the conversion of Lydia, Acts chapter 16, we find again, Paul goes to a river, finds some people talking about religious matters, speaks to them about Jesus. And one woman named Lydia hears him and invites him in and his companions to her home. The Lord opens her heart, the scripture tells us, and she believes and is baptized. Luke writes, "And after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, 'If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay.' And she prevailed upon us." You see what's going on here? The same pattern, this pattern that we see with Jesus and the men on the road to Emmaus. The church is following the Lord's pattern, what he did, as they fulfill their mission in the book of Acts. From that start at Lydia's house came one of the best churches in the New Testament era, the church of Philippi, the church to which the epistle to the Philippians was later written. A powerful church, a missionary church, one of Paul's most faithful supporters of his missionary endeavors. And in chapter 18 of Acts, we read of Paul going to the home of a man named Titius, in which many Corinthians believed and were baptized, again, in his home. So again and again, we see this pattern. It's a very simple pattern, yet very powerful. And the pattern consisted of these steps. It begins not with men, but with God. Again and again, we see the Lord has already prepared the way beforehand. He has already been working in the hearts and minds of an individual or a group of individuals. And then the Christians draw near. They walk with them in the way. They don't sit around waiting for the people to come to them. They go out to wherever they can to start a conversation about Jesus. And then they are invited into their homes, where they continue telling them the story of Jesus and expounding the scriptures. People come to faith and are baptized. And then that home becomes a gathering of believers that continues to grow and draw others in. So, when did the church move from the home into the sanctuary? Well, I think this goes back to Constantine. Constantine, the emperor of Rome, was the first emperor to stop the persecution of Christians and to legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire. In February of the year 313, he developed the Edict of Milan, which stated that Christians should be allowed to follow their faith without oppression. And this removed the penalties for professing Christianity, under which many had been martyred previously, and it returned any property that had been confiscated from the Christians. Constantine also embarked on a campaign to build beautiful basilicas that often replaced or were replacements for or conversions of the ancient pagan temples. These sanctuaries came to represent the official church. Was this good for the church? Well, yes. It enabled Christians finally to live in peace. But there were some negative consequences. As the church moved out of the homes and into the temples, it became more and more a religion of ritual and liturgy focused on what happened in these special buildings rather than a movement that spread from house to house. In America, the ancient pattern of small groups gathering to disciple people in the way has been replaced by Christian education, a pattern that's based on the American classroom model. These classrooms often become occasions for simply delivering information. The outward movement of Christians drawing near to people and telling the story of Jesus has been replaced by church programs designed to draw people to the church building and its programs. And this pattern used to work in America when there was a general cultural expectation that decent people go to church. And that culture has radically changed. Today, America is more like a pagan nation, more like the pagan nations of the first century than it is a Christian nation. And I think it's time to reassess our methodology. The coronavirus gives us an opportunity to reevaluate what we're doing, to maybe reboot the operating system. We have been forced by circumstances to do church differently, and we're discovering that it can be done differently. Everyone keeps asking, when can we go back to the way we were? But is that the right question? Maybe we should be asking, what is God telling us through this event? Is he telling us something about new ways to do church? We have been forced into our homes. Originally, the CDC was saying groups of more than 10 people at a time should not meet, but groups up to 10 people can meet. Maybe we should consider churches of no more than 10 people at a time. Small groups of believers spread throughout the cities. We have the means. We have the means to meet in small enclaves of believers, discipling one another and reaching out to our neighbors. And it's interesting that psychology kind of supports this. Most people don't open up about what is really going on in their lives in large groups. People don't grow without honest feedback. People resist feedback from people with whom they don't have a close relationship. And that level of closeness generally occurs in small groups. So there is a need for a revival or a restoration of the ancient Christian method of going in the way, drawing near to people, talking to them about Jesus, going into their homes, and starting small home groups that grow from house to house. Whenever the church has experienced true revival, small groups have been a key component throughout the history of the church. And so during this national crisis, I think we ought to be looking at how we can do church differently to better reach our generation and resist the tendency to follow the drumbeat of popular opinion. Try to listen to the voice of God. What is God telling us through this? Could it be that he's calling us not back to the way things had been prior to the coronavirus, but to return to the way it was in the beginning? Maybe we should look back to the future. In other words, look back to the origins. Can you imagine a church that actually did this? What would happen? What would happen if we actually put to practice this technique, if we can call it again, I don't think the early church thought of it as a technique. I think that they were so convinced, they were taken by this mission that they needed to do, that they just naturally sought the best way to do it. And that best way was going out to the people, talking to the people, starting small enclaves of discussion groups in the homes, baptizing believers, and from those small groups came small churches that were interlinked throughout the city. I think that's how the early church did it, and I think that could bring revival like we have never seen in our lifetime.